Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. It's a nice turnout, and we appreciate the fact that you have the interest in hearing what I think will be a very, very interesting discussion. I would like to have our parochial vicar, Father Jamie Power, come up and give an invocation to begin the proceedings tonight. Father.
Let us pray. O God, our Creator, from your provident hand we have received our right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You have given us the right and duty to worship you. We ask you to bless us in our vigilance for the gifts of religious liberty. Give us strength of mind and heart to readily defend our freedoms when they are threatened. Give us courage in making our voices heard on behalf of your people and the freedom of conscience of all people of faith. Grant, we pray, O Heavenly Father, a clear and united voice to all your sons and daughters, so that, with every trial withstood and every danger overcome, for the sake of our children and our grandchildren and all who will come after us, this great land will always be one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Father Jamie, and I would like to just quickly go through a few thank yous for people who have helped me put this together. St. George, our pastor Brian Vossler is out of town, unfortunately, this week, but he gave us the permission to use the facility, and I'd like to thank the people in the office. I'd like to thank John Mazza, who put together our sound system, make sure everything's working. I'd like to especially thank Mike George, who has been very helpful to me this past week. And also Rob Gibson, who is our videotaper, who has done a yeoman's job of pulling that all together in just a few days. So I was running a little late on getting a few of these loose ends taken care of. And I want to also thank Tom New. I don't know if he's here tonight, but he was helpful in promoting this, and he also was very encouraging to me and gave me a lot of advice that was quite useful. For those of you who didn't hear me speak a couple of weeks ago, the inspiration for this idea came from Bob Chittister. Bob Chittister has produced a series on the U.S. Constitution, which begins on QLN March 20th and then runs for 3 consecutive Fridays. And it will discuss the entire Constitution. And he challenged me to consider having a forum where we could bring members of each of the 3 faiths that have had a significant impact on our development of our country, Judaism and Catholicism and Protestantism, to come together and discuss the issue of freedom of religion and freedom of conscience, which we all know are critical freedoms. As Mickey and I had a session this morning at Prep, and Mickey stressed then the critical importance of freedom of religion to the founders. It was more important than freedom of speech in the way that they addressed and lined up the First Amendment. We also, this morning, I have something to share with you. When we were finished, during his talk, Mickey had spoken about the founder of Chick-fil-A and some of his views and how he's very outspoken, but he's a man of faith, and he's paid the price for it sometimes in his business. And Mickey also mentioned that he really enjoyed eating there, and when we went to the question and answer period, we asked for a question, and the first one was from a young fellow in the second row, and he had kind of a look on his face, and he said, so which dish do you like the most at Chick-fil-A? So that, and interestingly enough, that broke the ice, and we got some very good questions from those young men who are thinking very seriously about this issue as they prepare to go to some schools that might be hostile environments for them. As I mentioned, Bob Chittister was the inspiration for this. I would like to thank him very much for pushing me in this direction. I don't know how many of you know Bob, but Bob has made a tremendous contribution to this community in his work at QLN, the series that he's produced. He put QLN on the map, really, and he's put Erie on the map. I actually, in my travels around the country and my consulting work, I would occasionally meet people, and I'd tell them from Erie, and they say, oh, that's where WQLN is, because they knew the series that had been produced here, and they wanted to compliment Bob for his work. Well, tonight we're going to follow a pretty straightforward format. We're going to move chronologically through history. It seems appropriate that way. We're going to begin with Judaism, we'll move to Catholicism, and then to Protestantism. And I'd like to introduce our three guests, although I think most of you know them. But from the Temple Anshe Hesed is Rabbi Rob Murray. He is the recent arrival in Erie. He has, I think, jazzed up I told him that all thumbs up were positive in his favor from the report that I get in the LECOM locker room. And he's very welcome. And he has a desire, I think, to participate in more multi-faith outings like this and to make Reform Judaism a greater force in the community. He's told me he's working his way south from Ottawa, where he was born. Erie's the furthest south that he's been. So he's getting closer and closer to the tropics. So good luck, Rabbi. Our second speaker is Mickey Pohl. I always occasionally want to say his brother's name. Mickey is originally from Erie, and he attended East High. He was in the Marines 2 years, and he attended Princeton, went to law school at Pitt, and he has been with the Jones Day Law Firm for quite a long time. He has been someone who has fought the fight for religious freedom in his practice in constitutional law, taking on some very challenging cases, and most recently was involved in the case that he tried the case at the district and circuit court level, and was a consultant to the team that went to the Supreme Court to try the famous case that the Catholic Church brought to repeal the Affordable Care Act proviso that Catholic churches would have to offer contraception within their health plans. He is an interesting guy, to say the least, and we're glad to have him. He's very, very articulate. Finally, John Downey is a retired dean of Episcopal Cathedral of St. Paul, originally from Corey, so he's from the region, studied in Chicago. He was, for over 25 years, the dean. 30. Okay. And he is now the retired dean, and he's a canon theologian for the Episcopal Diocese of Northwestern Pennsylvania. He's working half-time, and he's a half-time pensioner. Is that how you describe yourself, John? Okay. So these will be our three speakers, and I'm going to ask Rabbi Rob Murray to begin our program. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. Can everybody hear okay? Okay. I think up here we can't hear what you said, but I hope you said nice things. Okay. We live really in a global global society, and if we ever needed any sort of proof of that, it is the events of recent arrests that surround the coronavirus. Now, if we ever needed any sort of proof, this is it. But really, in the ancient world, this idea that concepts and ideas and things were exchanged and crossed over countries and cultures is pretty common, and we've been doing that really since we invented transportation of any kind, whether it was the camel traders that went through the Middle East or ships or anything like that. To give you a little bit of background on Jewish law or Jewish ideas, most of Judaism is really based on the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, and it really is perhaps the oldest of written legal codes in existence. We can see the influence of this text into American society as we look at things like the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, a variety of Supreme Court decisions, things around death penalty or abortion or other significant issues, all borrow and rely on some of these foundational sacred texts. We have seen these texts quoted by political leaders, by legal scholars. Key concepts in American Jewish law, for instance, come straight out of the biblical text. One of the examples that I like to talk about is education. 2,000 years ago, in ancient Israel, we established what we call public school. And every city, every community had to offer, at the communal expense, education for the community. And it was there that the children were taught to read and to write. We see concepts of human rights that come right out of the biblical text. Things that teach us of how we treat each other, that call on us to treat each other with dignity and respect, to operate in business with ethics and a clear sense of treating people in the way in which we would like to be treated. We have a long description in the biblical text about personal responsibility, that we are responsible for our actions. We have to take that sense of who we are and our actions and be aware that we have to respond to them and to be held accountable for those actions. And it's not only for us as individuals, but we also bear responsibility for things that are on our property, animals that we may control. All of those things are attributed to our ledger or our responsibility. So let me take you through what I would do with our Sunday school kids, which is, how did we get from the Torah to today? So you have the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. That lays the foundation. Now, as with any biblical text, there's lots of questions. So rabbis for generations sit around asking questions, and eventually those questions get formalized into a body of literature called the Mishnah. And those are questions and answers that revolve around what exactly does this text mean when it says, observe Shabbat, observe that day, or guard that day, because there's 2 injunctions. One says to guard the day of Shabbat, the other is to observe the day of Shabbat. So why do we have 2? What do each of them mean? Lots of questions come up around almost every rule. So we go through those questions. Those questions are further expounded in another layer. And together, those questions and answers formalize what we know as the Talmud, which is probably the closest thing that we have to a code of Jewish law. But then you have a series of commentaries that follow the Talmud, that are in many cases being written till today. We have scholars who are writing responsa of Jewish legal response to various different modern topics. Things like, what do you do with computers? What do you do with societal issues that we never thought of when the Talmud may have been written? So we have this very long history, perhaps 5,000 years, of interpretation, and what was understood clearly 5,000 years ago, or 3,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, or even 200 years ago, is not the way in which we would understand something today. And so we need modern commentary. We need modern reinterpretation of these ancient laws. Because what Shabbat meant to the ancient Israelite in the desert may not be what Shabbat means for Anshe Chesed in Erie in 2020. There's this great rabbinic saying that comes actually out of the Talmud that says each and every generation has to struggle with these ideas, that we have to turn them and figure them out. And when we exercise that, when we struggle with it, it's in that struggle that we find the insight. So what I'd like to do is to just, really go back to a sense of the idea that Judaism really created this concept of a judicial system. And to do that, we have to think of the story of Moses having just led the Israelites free out of Egypt, and there they are camped out. And Moses is sitting on his bench, and everybody in the community is bringing the problems to him. Sounds familiar, right? So there Moses sits. Everybody's bringing every sort of problem. The big problems, the little problems, everything. And along comes Moses' father-in-law, Jethro. And Jethro he's got some experience in leadership, in political maneuverings. He is the high priest of Midian. He shows up, he sees what's going on, he puts his arm around his son-in-law and he says, "Come for a walk." And he explains to Moses that this is not a functioning system, that he can't possibly do this, and that Moses has to figure out how to create levels and layers and to delegate decision-making responsibilities. What happened possibly for the first time is what enabled Judaism, and I think what enables us, are two things. We adapted and we adopted. And through the ability to adapt to current circumstances and the willingness to adopt new ideas, and ideas that come from lots of different sources. It's not as if any of these systems or any of these faiths grew out of a total vacuum. We have all been significantly influenced, pushed, and pulled, and we create together. But it is that system of adapting and adopting that has made us able to address common needs and needs that are really for the current time. Sorry? Okay. So the more that we can actually engage in that adoption and that adaptation is really the key to success. Right? The more that we are open to that sense of working with each other, listening to each other, learning from each other, and then taking and adapting and adopting. Because what Moses does at the end of his father-in-law's visit is what? He says, "Thanks, Dad. I'll see you next vacation," and sends his father-in-law home. Goodbye. And then Moses takes his ideas and makes them part of, in his own way, what becomes Jewish tradition. And I think that is what has happened and continues to happen with not only the way in which religions function with each other, but I think also in general society. Society borrows ideas from lots of different areas, and certainly in the sense of our topic this evening, how it affects society in general and the legal system. We have taken some of these moral ideas and we have made them part of our legal system, and we have given them a societal voice that it may have come from a particular faith tradition, or it may be something that was shared with multiple traditions. And we have made them part of our entire society's response to a particular topic or idea. So, I'm sure there'll be a chance for questions and debate and conversation after, but we'll leave it there for now.
So, as you heard, I'm Mickey Pohl, and my colleagues here are used to being up on the altar, so to speak, looking out. I'm not used to that, so I bring the perspective of a Catholic and also someone who's been in a lot of litigation that deals with religious freedom. And I have some pretty strong views, but But I'll begin by saying I love Erie. It was a wonderful place to grow up. I love the values of this community. I love the way people treat each other, can disagree without being disagreeable, and the spirit of volunteerism and the Judeo-Christian values that permeate lives. And I asked George Blakesley, do you think more than 8 people will show up, counting us and the videographer? That's my heart good, not only see you sitting there, but also so many friends. My law partners, I joined Jones Day, it was 175 lawyers, and then it was 2,700 lawyers when I left January 1st with 40 offices around the world. And I was the oldest partner by a couple years out of 920 partners. And they treated me like the doddering old uncle. But it was time to go. But I saw Mrs. Pollock here, the daughter of Sam Roberts. I was Justice Roberts and then Chief Justice Roberts' first and only law clerk from Erie. And what an honor that was for me and how much I learned from that wise man. So, Barbie, I just wanted to do a shout out. I also, I'm going to get tears in my eyes. I see Judy Allstott. I was on the board at Lord Corporation for years. Don Allstott was a mentor to me. And I can't put into words how much I learned from people in Erie growing up on the East Side. It's funny for me sitting here talking in church because the Sisters of St. Joseph at St. Anne's wouldn't let us talk in church. But, times have moved on. Anyway, thanks for being here. I always say I get nervous, though, when I come to Erie because it's a New Testament passage that no one's a prophet in his hometown. So let me just share some experiences and concerns. And I don't want to be Jeremiah. Jeremiah was the Old Testament prophet, the kind of, in the book of Lamentations, I think, walk around telling everybody, I'm starting to see things that are bad that concern me, and I'm afraid it's going to get worse. And turns out he was right. Things got worse for Jerusalem. But can you imagine the neighbors, when Jeremiah would walk over to visit with them, they'd turn off the lamps and bar the door. Here comes hangdog Jeremiah again. He's concerned about everything. But I don't want to be Jeremiah, but I'm telling you, with regard to freedom of religion, as I said, I grew up doing corporate litigation. And, I represented Prince Charles' interests, and I've been with John Paul II and more recently Pope Francis. And I've been with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia in the last few years. The things that have happened to me, I can't believe. It tells you the land of opportunity and the kind of blessings I had growing up in Erie and with mentors and things. But our republic is going to be 244 years old. And if you look at the history of the drafting of the First Amendment, the first freedom in the First Amendment is freedom of religion. And the history of America is most of the people who came here in the colonial days came fleeing religious persecution. And they were different denominations. And our First Amendment, as you know, has 2 parts to it. It has an establishment clause that says the government can't establish a government-endorsed religion. We were going to be a nation of many religions. The government couldn't favor one over the other. What gets lost in the translation in today's era is a lot of people think they hear about the separation, a wall separating church and state. That wall separating church and state is not in the First Amendment. It comes from an 1802 letter Thomas Jefferson wrote to a Danbury Baptist group that was afraid Jefferson was going to make the Church of England the official church of the U.S. It needs context. But people grab onto that when they want to bleach all religion out of public discourse and out of public life in America. My view of the drafting of the Establishment Clause is, and there's plenty of evidence of this, and it's reflected in the early decisions, the framers understood that a stable society would have people with a fundamental right to practice their religion. And most people, the overwhelming majority, had a religion, and it wasn't just something they did in a house of worship. It was woven into the fabric of life. The kind of stable society the framers envisioned was going to have Judeo-Christian values. It wouldn't have a state-sponsored this religion or that religion. You could pick your religion, you could have no religion. But they didn't intend for our government, our society, to have no religion. The second part of the First Amendment is the free exercise clause. And it says free exercise, and those aren't words that were carelessly chosen. The different colonies had their own religious guarantees that were slightly different. There was a lot of debate between 1776 and 1789 about how to word the First Amendment. They picked free exercise to be the broadest term because they understood, the framers understood, and they intended that you could choose to practice your religion throughout your life. So now, when you hear a politician say, and this started a few years ago at a Cairo conference during the Obama administration, they started talking about freedom of worship. That is a buzzword. Freedom of worship is much narrower than what we were guaranteed in the Constitution. And it came up in the Zubik case where Father Scott Jabo and Bishop Persico and Cardinal Dolan and Bishop Zubik were witnesses on the contraception mandate, a case I tried in Pittsburgh and then got combined with the Little Sisters of the Poor case, went to the Supreme Court, as you know. But the Justice Department people kept talking about, well, this doesn't violate the First Amendment, forcing the Little Sisters of the Poor or Erie Cathedral Prep to buy abortion insurance and sterilization insurance and everything. And Father Jabo gave great testimony, as did Bishop Persico and Cardinal Dolan and Bishop Zubik, that says, if I'm remembering Father Jabo's testimony, he said, when Judge Schwab asked him good questions, how can I teach my course at Prep about Christian ethics and morality, and tell them what we believe and don't believe, then go back to my office and cobble together names for insurance policies where we're going to have to provide free abortions and sterilizations? The exercise of my religion isn't just saying Mass. It affects how I treat my employees, what's offered in my insurance policy, and so on. So a lot of times you hear politicians say, well, we're all for religion. We have freedom of worship. I'm all for that. That is not what Americans have. They have the free exercise of religion beyond houses of worship. The other area where, now that I'm sewing down semantics, you saw all the riots in Hong Kong. And the Chinese government is trying now to put on a happy face about how tolerant they are. Well, if you look at all the constitutions around the world, like Russia and China, it has some language that makes you think they have freedom of religion. That's baloney. The Chinese took ads in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times trying to repair their image that talked about all the freedoms they have, freedoms of travel, freedoms of commerce, and all this stuff. And it said freedom of religious belief. Now, I've been to Beijing. You try to go to Mass, they take your picture coming and going in the church. They say it's traffic control. They want to know their locals who are trying to go worship at a Catholic church or a synagogue or something. They say freedom of religious belief. That means, oh, you're free to at home to believe whatever you want to believe. Just don't try to practice it in our sphere. Wherever you find totalitarian governments, they want the government to be God, and they don't trust people who have the traditional Judeo-Christian beliefs because they can't control you. And the difference between Marx, Lenin, Engels, Stalin, and Xi in China, their view of the world is the government effectively does what's good for the common good. They tell you what your rights can be, supposedly for the good of all. Our Declaration of Independence refers to the Creator as Supreme Being 4 times. And it says that the rights enshrined therein, including freedom of religion, are unalienable rights given to us by the Creator. Americans created a government where we gave the government limited, enumerated powers, and we retained certain fundamental human rights like the free exercise of religion, freedom of religion. And now we're seeing a lot of things that concern me because the kind of freedom of religion that was enshrined in the Constitution, that has been preserved, that people have fought and died for, and a lot of our grandparents came to America seeking, is being undercut. In the 244 years of our nation, I have never seen such attacks on freedom of religion as we're seeing right now. Now, people, you may think that's a little hyperbolic. See, things seem to be fine. You know, nobody's interfering with. Let me tell you the kinds of things that set off the alarm bells. And I want to sensitize you to them, and I'm telling everybody I can. These are the kind of things that trouble me. And Hillary Clinton spoke in April 2015 at the Women in the World Summit. She addressed religion. She said, rights, speaking generally, have to exist in practice, not just on paper. Laws have to be backed up with resources and political will. And this is what set me off. She said, in deep-seated cultural codes, religious beliefs and structural biases have to be changed. Religious beliefs have to be changed. That's the first time, according to my historical research, any candidate for President of the United States said publicly that she thought the president or government would have to change religious beliefs held by Americans. It didn't say should be changed. I would urge people to rethink. You know, she thinks there's biases in traditional Catholic and Christian views sometimes. She didn't say I would urge people to be more open-minded. She said have to be changed. The mainstream media gave her a free pass. Nobody stood up and said have to be changed by whom? By government? By the president? That is antithetical to the free exercise of religion. When she said that, she got a complete free pass. Then I talk about the way Hollywood and the media and TV and the advertising community trivializes traditional Judeo-Christian beliefs. And I don't want to be paranoid, but I think they bash Catholics as hard as can be. But this is a quote from a fundraiser in San Francisco that President Obama had in 2008. He said, you go into these small towns in Pennsylvania. Of course, I thought, well, I'm from a small town in Pennsylvania, Erie. And like a lot of small towns in the Midwest, the jobs have been gone now for 25 years and nothing's replaced them. Well, there were a lot more manufacturing jobs when I grew up in the 50s than today. So I'm listening. And it says, and they fell through the Clinton administration and the Bush administration. So he made sure he was taking a shot at both sides of the aisle. And each successive administration that said somehow these communities are going to regenerate, and they have not. And I think Erie did not deteriorate. It shrunk, but it didn't degenerate. This is what then candidate Obama said that drove me crazy. And it's not surprising then that they, meaning the people in the small towns of Pennsylvania, it's not surprising then they get bitter. They cling to guns or religion, or antipathy toward people who aren't like them, or anti-immigrant sentiment, or anti-trade sentiment, as a way to explain their frustrations. That strikes me as an outrageous statement for somebody to say that the only reason people in small towns like Erie practice their faith or cling to religion is because the economy's bad and manufacturing jobs have gone. And that's why people, somebody else calls us the deplorables, that's why they cling to guns. That was not only an insult, but what I call the trivializing religion. The strength of communities like Erie and Akron, all across America, has been the shared values, and in good times and in bad times, people respecting the tenets of their faith. Honor thy father and thy mother. Have a Sabbath and keep it holy. Thou shalt not steal. That goes back to Moses and the Ten Commandments, and it's come down to us. It isn't like people get religion when the jobs are leaving. The strength of America has been the ongoing faith and values that we've seen. So I can go on and on. You can tell I have some feelings about this. But let me just give you a couple more instances as evidence that we are in a tough time now in bashing traditional religions. And I'm bringing now the Catholic perspective. Article 6 of the Constitution, as many of you know, specifically says, there shall be no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust in the United States. Which means you can have any religion you want, and if you're qualified, you can get a federal job. So a wonderful law professor at Notre Dame, Amy Coney Barrett, got nominated for a seat on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. My son had her in law school at Notre Dame. Everybody loves her. Great record, absolute integrity. When she went for her confirmation hearing, Senator Feinstein, who didn't like her just because she's pro-life, she grilled Amy Coney Barrett about her religious beliefs. And she said, the dogma, meaning the Catholic dogma that appeared in Amy's writings, the dogma lives loudly within you, and that's a concern. That kind of religious bias, when federal judges come up, is completely inappropriate under Article 6 of the Constitution. But the media didn't go off on that, because the kind of people we have in the entertainment community and the mainstream media are hung up on a couple different issues, and they don't like traditional Christian beliefs on that. And they especially don't like the Catholics' beliefs. So basically, people were saying, well, you sound too Catholic. We're not going to vote for your confirmation, even though she's honest and a scholar, and they didn't. So this was not an isolated incident. Brian Busher was nominated for United States District Court seat. Great record, everything. He went for his confirmation hearing. Senator Mazie Hirono of Hawaii was outraged that Brian Busher was a member of the Knights of Columbus. They called the Knights of the Columbus an extremist radical group because it had filed some amicus briefs that were pro-life. And Knights of Columbus believes that marriage is between one man and one woman. Mazie Hirono said, if confirmed, do you intend to end your membership? She said, would you recuse yourself from all cases in which the Knights of Columbus has taken a position? It's a 100-year-old Catholic fraternal organization that does mostly charitable work, has 1.8 million members, and she called it a radical element in our society that no member should be allowed to be a federal judge. Now, this is the kind of stuff that occasionally we would see anti-Christian, anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic bigotry, but it got tamped down pretty good, in the past. It popped up with the Blaine amendments, and when Kennedy ran for president, and there's been undercurrents of anti-Semitism from time to time and anti-Christian belief, but now it's kind of gone over the edge. And a quick story. Almost everybody knows Chick-fil-A. There's one in Erie. By a lot of surveys, it is voted the best fast food chain in America. Customers are happy. It has no litigation, no employee complaints. It pays good wages and health care benefits and everything. It was founded by a guy named Truett Cathy, who I had the good fortune to meet a couple times. He was an evangelical Christian in the South. One of the corporate rules is they don't open on Sunday. Sunday, people should be home with their families. So this has kept them from being able to bid on rest stops on turnpikes and things where you need to be open 24/7. So Truett Cathy died. His son, Dan Cathy, also an evangelical Christian, inherited voting control of the company. He's the major shareholder. But he is not the corporation. It is a corporate entity that does a great job, pays its taxes, has no problems. Dan Cathy was coming out of a meeting. He got ambushed by a reporter who said, is it true that as a Christian you believe that marriage is one man and one woman, and something about, people are born with a gender and you can't just change from day to day. You can't. And Dan Cathy said, I was raised Christian. One of my beliefs is that marriage is one man and one woman. So the LGBT community went crazy. And you've seen a lot of places they demonstrate at Chick-fil-A, and then customers show up, the next day and line up out the door to sort of push back. But now, San Antonio, Texas, and Buffalo airport authorities put out requests for bids from fast food chains to bid on space in their airports. San Antonio and Buffalo said they would not award the contract to Chick-fil-A because of the beliefs of the major shareholder that are offensive to the LGBT communities in those cities. Now, that is exactly what's not supposed to happen under the First Amendment. This is government bodies penalizing somebody economically for their personal religious beliefs. That's not supposed to happen, but it's become kind of a non-event. We're getting used to this sort of traditional religious bashing. So, there's a lot more examples, but let me just wrap up my part here by saying I am concerned that there's so much of this going on that the media either isn't reporting or they're misreporting. And the obvious example is the kids from the Cincinnati Covington Catholic School. When that story hit, and the one kid had a Trump hat on, Make America Great, but it was a Catholic school. I think it was a pro-life march in front of the Lincoln Memorial. And it was reported that the kids were heckling a Vietnam veteran who happened to be a Native American, and they were picking on this old guy. And the media jumped all over it. I don't want to sound paranoid, but the combination of the kid having a conservative hat on and being from a Catholic school fed the flames. Then somebody had a 2-hour video of everything that did happen. And it showed, first, that the guy wasn't a Vietnam veteran, he had been in the service, that he approached the kids while others in his entourage were shouting bigoted, racist, anti-religion slogans, and the guy was beating the drum in the kid's face. It turned out a fair reading of what went on was radically different than what the media had hung out there. Because it fit their narrative that somehow Christians are all bigots and, they're intolerant and everything. But once the real story came out, CNN and some other news media ran the fake news story a while longer. So the boy, whose name is Sandman, sued CNN and I think the Washington Post. But the big surprise was, usually you sue the media, they claim New York Times versus Sullivan, they have immunity, they're not going to pay, and they dig in and fight. CNN settled the lawsuit pretty quickly because they didn't want my guess is, they didn't want their emails coming out saying, should we kill the story now that we know it's fake news? So, let me just finish my harangue here by reminding us there's a lot of this going on that's unlike what has happened in the last 200 years. And a lot of, we pay our taxes, we participate in the process. We have to be sensitized to us that freedom of religion is being eroded now. The Pew Research Group does regular data studies that show, a lot of things. That the millennials, there's a significant percentage that thinks the nation and the world will be better off without organized religion. This is how far off we've gotten, but if you look at the ads in the mainstream network TV shows, they're getting fed this from an early age. Sesame Street has different characters now. Disney has its own agenda. And I'm reminded of two things. First, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has a great essay, Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenships. And it recommends that Catholics and all citizens vote their consciences, but do it after sincere reflection and being informed. And the second thing I like to quote, because John F. Kennedy quoted it, and all of us at St. Anne's School, were dancing when he became the first Catholic president. He quoted Edmund Burke saying, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." And I think about Germany in the 30s. Of course, it's a high-risk proposition now to talk anything about Germany because you're going to offend somebody. But, Germany was full of great philosophers and intellectuals and legal scholars and people, writing beautiful music. And when the brown shirts and the thugs and all this beer hall stuff started, they thought, well, this is just the fringe. This isn't really going to affect me. But it did, because the good people were silent too long. And they didn't participate actively when they didn't in the political system until it was too late. And we all know what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust. And in Germany, the first ones that, Hitler didn't want priests and intellectuals, and it was between Germany and Poland, 1 million Catholics got killed there too. So I don't want to be Jeremiah, I don't want to be paranoid, but there's a lot of things we're seeing now all the time that we're being too quiet about. So don't be afraid to say there's more than just freedom of worship you have as an unalienable right. You have the free exercise of religion, and the test of the last 5,000 years, I think, is Judeo-Christian values have served society best. If you think about our nation, we are the first global power that when we won the big war, we didn't grab territory and enslave the people we beat in Germany and Japan. We put our Judeo-Christian values to work and rebuilt their nations and educated them and tried to get them to have systems with a constitution and participatory democracy like our framers gave us. I just don't want us to lose it. Thank you.
Are we working? All right. Well, I'm going to try to race us through some history, long-term history, and some more recent history, particularly looking at it through the lens of various types of Protestantism. So I suppose I want to begin with Jesus and remind us that Jesus was not a Republican, Jesus was not a Democrat, Jesus was not a Protestant, Jesus was not a Catholic, Jesus was a Jew, and I think he still is. And Jesus said one time when he was questioned about taxes, he said in a saying that most of us will know, give the emperor what belongs to the emperor, and give to God what belongs to God. And those of us who remember the old King James translation of that, it was much more beautiful. It said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. And that sort of set the framework for the discussion that we've had ever since about what's the role of the civic realm and what's the role of the religious realm. What is the emperor's and what is God's? Jesus set the question, and we've been wrestling with that question ever since. Early on, when the Jews who were followers of Jesus and then the Gentiles who joined them were in a process of becoming divided from Jews who were not followers of Jesus, and the church, as we think of it, the Christian church, began to emerge, it was, how did it carve out a place for itself within the Roman Empire? The Roman Empire was not Christian. Here was a new group of people claiming somebody else other than Caesar was Lord and King. And how could they have a place within the Roman Empire? So that was the first time that this issue began to raise itself in terms of Christians. Then once the Christian church became the empire, and the division between Christians and Jews, as we think of it today, had happened, then it was a question of what's the place of Jews within a Christian empire? And it's not a history for Christians to be very proud of, but that was a question. And then in the 16th century, when the Protestant Reformation bursts into flames, it was in the works for a long period before that, but it really came out into the open in the 16th century. Then it was a question of how can these Protestant Christian communities find a place within a world that is dominated again by Rome, but now Rome as the seat of the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. And then, to go one more step, as Protestantism begins to take different expressions, it becomes a question of what's the rights and the roles of Protestants alongside of other Protestants. Took various shapes in Europe, pretty regional in Europe. Certain territories would be Catholic, and other territories would be Lutheran, and other territories would be Reformed. And most everybody around you was from the same religious group that you were. So you didn't have what we have come to call in the United States denominations side by side on the same street. They were somewhere else, hundreds of miles away. That was mostly what it was like in Europe, with the exception of the Anabaptists, the precursors of today's Amish and Mennonites, whom everybody hated and persecuted, Protestants and Catholics. In England, where my tradition took shape, the Church of England was the established church, but there were Roman Catholics who wished to continue to be Roman Catholics, and there were Protestants for whom the Church of England was not reformed enough. And how could they find a way to live together within one country? These are all brand new questions. They had never arisen before, in this particular way, amongst Christians anyway. The phrase that keeps appearing throughout that time, from that early time when there were just a small group of Christians trying to find a place in the Roman Empire, is the word conscience. Conscience meaning not only what one believes inside, but conscience as the right to practice those beliefs, both in terms of the worshiping community and its liturgy, its worship, its cult, and the social principles that go with those beliefs. We really have to credit the Baptists for taking this to its ultimate conclusion, that every individual needs to have freedom of conscience about these matters, and government or any outside force cannot really interfere with that, can't impose itself upon it, can't force people to believe something that they really don't believe. And so there needs to be, and the Baptists championed this and eventually prevailed, because the colonies were all different on this question. There were different solutions to this. We like to say that the Pilgrims left England because my church, it happens to be in this case, was persecuting them. And that's true. But then they came here and persecuted everybody else that wasn't like them. It was finally the Baptists who said, we just can't have it like this. There has to be total freedom of conscience for everyone to not only hold different beliefs, but also to practice them. And so the Constitution of the new United States, enshrined, as we just heard a few minutes ago, in Article 6 and in the First Amendment, and the idea of non-establishment and free exercise. The 14th Amendment, by the way, after the Civil War, said that those that those rights also applied in the states, because the First Amendment in the Constitution only applied to the federal government. It still would have been possible for Pennsylvania to declare that the Presbyterian Church was the official church of Pennsylvania. But after the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court has ruled that those same rights apply in the states as well as nationally. But what I want to say, having gotten to that point, is that the concept of religious liberty, of religious freedom, is a right thing and a good thing and a necessary thing, but it also is to some degree aspirational and never can quite be absolute. We're always negotiating about it, which leads to some of the reason, I suppose, that we're having this discussion tonight. So there's both the aspiration of total religious freedom, but the pragmatic negotiation about it in two ways. First of all, on what are its limits? We all like to say that anyone should be able to believe and practice whatever they believe in their conscience. But if there were a religion that believed in child sacrifice, we would not find that tolerable, no matter what their sincere religious views about it were, no matter what their sacred scripture said. Even if they had a leader who claimed to be the direct mouthpiece of God, we would not find it tolerable to allow a religion in our country to practice child sacrifice. We did not find it tolerable for a religion to practice polygamy. We did not find it tolerable. Although I understand in Utah it's being reconsidered now for other reasons than religious reasons. I don't know enough about that, so don't ask me about it. I've just heard that. Here's a case that brought this into focus within most of our lifetimes. Bob Jones University, for much of its history, did not admit black students to the university. 1970s, they began to admit black students, but they had to be married. Come to your own conclusions why that was something that was required. Black students were only allowed to come to Bob Jones University if they were married. The next evolution of that principle was that no one at Bob Jones, at Bob Jones University would not allow interracial marriage, interracial dating, or advocating interracial dating. You could not go to school there if you were in favor of interracial dating. And you certainly couldn't go to school there if you were going to do it. Finally, the IRS said that they would not be allowed to have tax-exempt status if they held to these principles. And it was litigated for several years, and in 1983, the Supreme Court agreed that they would lose their tax-exempt status over this question. At that point in history, we found it intolerable that that kind of racial practice would be acceptable to us. So we are always negotiating limits. What are the limits to absolute religious freedom? The second thing we negotiate are what practices can we tolerate that go against the general consensus of our society. They're usually called religious exemptions. What could a religious group or a believer do that really is against what would be normal in other aspects of our life together? Probably going to get in some trouble about this one, but it's probably okay. I'm semi-retired. But we're sitting in the building of a religious tradition which I love very deeply. But we, as a society, have said it is acceptable for this tradition to not allow women to be ordained leaders in this church. Now, there's all sorts of religious reasons why that would be the case. But in most aspects of American society, that would not be accepted. But we believe, as a society, that there is an exemption in this case, as we do in many other cases, for many other things. It all comes around again to the exercise of conscience. Conscience when it comes to the area of what do you believe. Conscience when it comes to how do you practice it in terms of religious practices, and what probably is the roughest edge in our society, how do we deal with how it has a social impact. So if somebody wants to believe that God is a purple cow who lives on the moon, who cares? If you really want to believe that in this society, who cares? But if it becomes something that my religious belief compels me to act in society in a way that impinges upon someone else who doesn't share that same belief with me, that's where the negotiations happen. I love the principle that conscience is appropriate to use as a shield, but not a sword. I can invoke conscience to protect myself from doing something that I don't believe I should do. I cannot invoke conscience to prohibit someone else from doing something they're entitled to do. It's too bad it's not as easy to implement as it sounds, but it's a great operating principle. Conscience as a shield, but not a sword. So you know the kind of issues where all these things are being negotiated in our time and in our society: abortion, contraception, LGBT rights, the status of minority religions like Muslims. I want to spend a little bit more time on another one that might not necessarily come up when we have these kind of discussions, and that is the whole business of religious communities being tax exempt. Churches don't pay taxes. Clergy don't pay taxes on their housing. Did you know that? It's been a pretty cool benefit for me over all the years. But the clergy designate a certain amount of their salary as a housing allowance and do not pay federal tax on it. So, for all sorts of reasons, our society believes it's appropriate for religious groups to not have to pay taxes. What's one of the trade-offs from that? One of the trade-offs from that is something called the Johnson Amendment. And yes, it's that Johnson, LBJ, when he was a senator, and the IRS tax code was being determined in the Congress, and he was afraid that some nonprofits were going to campaign against him back in Texas. And so he proposed, and without any opposition, the tax code adopted the Johnson Amendment, which says that nonprofits and religious groups, it's a rather long way of boiling it down to those two, that religious groups, I'll focus on, cannot participate in endorsing or not endorsing a candidate during an election campaign, or they lose their tax-exempt status. So a father gets up in the pulpit and says, "You're supposed to vote for this person because that's who I support," this church could lose its tax-exempt status. Now, clergy as individuals can be part of politics. They have to make it clear that I'm acting in my own name here and not as a representative of my church. That they can do. But they can't do it in any way in which they are perceived to be representing their church, their synagogue, their religious group. Can speak against policy or for it. You can call out political leaders about particular beliefs or sayings, but you can't endorse them or unendorse them. Mr. Trump campaigned by saying he would totally destroy the Johnson Amendment. He wants the clergy to be able to openly endorse or not endorse candidates from the pulpit. Once he became the president, he claimed that he did that through an executive order. Actually, what he did in the executive order was he instructed the Treasury Department not to go after churches that it could be implied that they were endorsing a candidate. Still said that you couldn't get in the pulpit and endorse a candidate if you were clergy. So it's presented on the one side as the Johnson Amendment somehow prohibits free speech. Clergy, according to the First Amendment, clergy should be able to get up and say anything they want to say in the pulpit. But when we think about some of the benefits that come from the Johnson Amendment, we might see that it's actually quite wise. Do we really want someone coming in and saying, Pastor, if you don't endorse so-and-so for senator, you're going to lose my pledge? Or maybe worse, saying, Pastor, if you would endorse so-and-so, you're going to get an extra $20,000 in the collection at the end of the year. Or some political group coming to a church and basically taking it over to turn it into an agent of politics. So this is another place where we're negotiating. Is it free, absolute free speech, that the clergy should be able to say anything they want, or are there other considerations, and should churches be paying taxes after all? The issue becomes, how do we determine that consensus of the wider society while we're negotiating these limits and these exceptions, these exemptions? Back to a little bit of history, and then I'll bring this around to the home stretch. In Europe, most of the Christian churches, including the Protestant churches, once things settled down, were established churches. The Church of England, which still is the established church. Hardly any English people go to it, but it is the established Church of England. Church of Sweden, other churches in Scandinavia and in Germany were the established church. The Baptist tradition represented a believer's church. One had to make a personal choice to become part of a voluntary assembly of believers. And that's what prevailed in the United States. It's a matter of individual conscience and voluntary association. Churches like mine, churches like the Roman Catholic Church, the Lutheran Church, they come from a European heritage where we were established churches. But you know what? In the United States, we're all Baptists to a certain degree. We choose to belong to a religious group by our individual choice. So we had no established church, officially, but we kind of did. We had the unofficial establishment that is sometimes called the WASP establishment. Where am I? Lost my mic. Here we are. We had the WASP establishment of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. You wonder if that's true. Just look at who, up until recently, gets elected President of the United States. And most of you are old enough to remember the amazing uproar it was about John F. Kennedy as a Roman Catholic, that he might become president. The questions at that time, whether he could really give full allegiance to the United States or whether he had a higher allegiance to the Pope. Those were the questions. And Kennedy had to go appear before a group of Baptist pastors in Houston and basically say, my religion will have absolutely nothing to do with my presidency, in order to get past that gate. And about the same time, the document on religious freedom was passed at Vatican II, and I think that also helped. But even, I think that with the growth of the Roman Catholic Church in the United States and the attempts to assess what in the world happened with the Holocaust, we talked less about a WASP establishment and more about a Judeo-Christian consensus. So look who's left running for president now. 3 white men, a Protestant, a Catholic, and a Jew. When we had that establishment, a lot about that wasn't good, but part of what was good was that there was a coherent worldview that was guiding society. And when we negotiated these questions about religious limits and exceptions, there was a worldview that was guiding it, that could be bounced off against it. And that has been lost. We have become more diverse, more multicultural, more multi-religious, more and more people, especially younger people, who claim no religion. We have, out of necessity, I think, developed a social common life which is entirely secular. It almost needs to be. So that when we walk around in our day-to-day life, in our jobs and in most of our life, we don't talk about God. God is looked upon as what we think privately, what we believe privately. So we have multiculturalism, diversity, a public secularism. Belief is looked upon as something private and individual. It's difficult to develop a consensus in order to negotiate the limits and the exceptions involved in religious freedom. And so what have we done? we've resorted to doing this almost solely through legislation and lawsuits. And the laws and court decisions, important as they are not sufficient to develop a consensus in society. They become an exercise in winners and losers, an exercise in partisanship, an exercise in not appreciating the complexity not only of issues but of people. Laws and court decisions are necessary, but they're not sufficient. We all know that if abortion is outlawed, abortions will still happen. The law itself is not going to be sufficient. We need to work on finding ways, now that there is no dominant group, including Christianity, now that America is not dominated by any one group or ideology, we need to find ways to work at finding common ground and compromise. Common ground where we know we share values, and compromise where we're willing to live with things that aren't exactly the way we wish they could be, but we can live with it. And then, and only then, resort to legislation and laws. And the only way that we can work at finding common ground and compromise is that we do what we're doing right now, is get out of our tribes, get out of the echo chambers of people who we already agree with and who already agree with us, and step out into the public square and encounter each other and engage each other and try to listen and learn and understand. And we can do that, thanks be to God, in the United States precisely by claiming the space that has been opened up for us by the First Amendment of the Constitution.
We have some time for questions. I guess we had some limitations on our miking, so we'll have to do a relay method of getting the questions up here. But those were three excellent presentations, and I took about 4 pages of copious notes. Can you hear me now? And,
It's not good.
Good.
Yeah, it's pretty echoey.
Well, I'd love to hear from someone. Okay,
My name is Mark. I'll give you just one question. And it's a question from the missing chair. The chair that's missing is secularism. I see Judaism, Catholicism, Protestantism. I don't see the chair for secularism. Why secularism is an important representative at this point is because of what the panel has alluded to, the shifts we've been seeing, especially among the millennial generation, where no preference, none at all, is the dominant choice. So the question from the secular chair I'm going to ask is one that was asked a couple hundred years ago by a Secretary of State. The Secretary of State of this country, and deep down you may know this person because the country was England, said this: the state, our government, our country, can never be in safety where there is toleration of more than one religion. For there is no enemy so great as that for religions. And therefore, they that differ in the service of their God can never agree in the service of their country. Now, that was alluded to with the fears that came up with John F. Kennedy back then. I'll just repeat the last maxim and ask for your response to it, because it seems to me this is the direction our society, secularism, is now taking. The quotations that we heard kind of echo this kind of view, that they that differ in the service of their God can never agree in the service of their country.
Who'd like to take it?
Well, you know, I'll take a stab at it. If I understand the question, if we were writing on a clean slate in this particular point in history, just like the recent Prince George's County case in the Supreme Court with the cross from World War I that was in a roundabout, you know, a Christian cross is a World War I memorial. The American Freedom From Religion Foundation, the American Humanist Association, somebody said that kind of cross has no business on public land in this day and age, and they wanted to take it down, and it led to arguments like, you know, take all the crosses out of Arlington Cemetery in Normandy, or, you know, and the secularists and the humanists and everybody are sort of like they're debating it now. But we're in a nation that has a constitution, and the Constitution was written to allow religion and the free exercise of different religions. And maybe you'd say, well, if it was written today, it'd be different. We have a mechanism to be used to change the Constitution if things change. My own view of constitutional interpretation is like Scalia's. Are the rights in there, or are they not in there? If they're not in there, maybe the legislature can do it, and if you don't like what the legislature passes, vote them out and get new ones and change the law going the other way. But the Constitution is something more than that. The problem I had with things like Kennedy's decision in the gay marriage cases, and in Roe versus Wade, Justice Scalia said, you know, the evil wasn't just the result from a Christian perspective of killing fetuses and unborn children. But what was insidious about that was it created a constitutional right that wasn't in the Constitution. There was the kind that would clearly be rejected by the framers, and it took it out of the hands of the voters. And once you start allowing Supreme Court justices to create new rights to put in there based on this is what I think the times demand or what the polls are telling me, then you've made judges super legislators. That's why when Scalia got confirmed, he was confirmed 97-0, even though he was real conservative, real Catholic. Today, the reason we have the fights we've had over Kavanaugh and Gorsuch and the next one, no matter what party's in there, Garland was nominated, it never came up, is because people now are seeing that because of this view that you can keep morphing the Constitution to have new rights or no rights, take things in and out that aren't in the text, that you've eliminated the need to ever amend the Constitution. You just get judges in there who are going to put in rights based on the trends of the time. So, you know, my view is we operate within a structure that was set up, a great structure. It was set up in 1789, and that's where we are, and it's in our interest to keep dealing with that. If we were writing a new Constitution for a new nation, you know, the secularists would want to word a lot of things different, and the humanists and somebody else, and maybe you'd negotiate and come out with something different. But I'm looking at where we are in America today, and we got off the rails, at least my view, and I know Justice Ginsburg and Sotomayor and Kagan don't agree with this, that they think it's a living document where you can put new rights in based on the trends of the time. And I don't think that's good policy. I don't know if that answers your question squarely, but we're operating within an established framework, but there is an empty chair here.
Do you have any other questions?
I would come back on that if you don't mind.
Please.
The secularism is a phrase that it's easy to use without knowing for sure what someone means when they're using it. So maybe I could make three distinctions, and undoubtedly there are more. There's a kind of secularism that comes from weariness at having seen religious people kill each other and just don't want to be a part of that. I can take you to Oxford and show you within a very short walk a place where Protestants killed Catholics, and then we'll go to another place where Catholics killed Protestants. And there are people that just say, I don't want anything to do with something like that. So that's a type of secularism. Another type is hostile to religion. Not just I don't want anything to do with it, but it's hostile to it, the kind of French Revolution secularism. And another, and this is what I usually mean and what I meant when I use it primarily was, it's just a way of functioning together. It's a way that we can exist side by side in a society with different points of view. So I think all of those are ways that word can be used. I would think that with a lot of sympathy for people, as you probably could pick up in my emotional tone, with a lot of sympathy for people that look at the way that religious people have behaved and said, no. I have sympathy for that. At the same time, I remember Sharon and I were at a bed and breakfast a few years ago, and it was a house that they had 3 bedrooms. So there were 2 other couples there. And I drove into the driveway of the house, and one of the cars had an NRA sticker on it, and the other one had a World Wildlife Federation sticker on it. And I thought, this could really be an interesting couple of nights.
Like Thanksgiving dinner.
As it turned out, they were Sharon and I, sort of mainline Protestants of the high church variety, Episcopalians. There were another couple who were Jews from Chicago, and there was another couple who were Unitarians from Bloomington, Indiana, one of whom said, I don't believe in God, which you can do as a Unitarian. And we had wonderful conversations. And most all of our conversations were about the things that our congregations were doing to help the poor and needy in our communities. That's mostly what we talked about. And one time I looked around and said, you know what? Here we are, 2 mainline Protestants, 2 Jews, 2 Unitarians, one of whom is an atheist, but I think we all believe in love your neighbor as yourself. And they said, yeah, we do. So I think people from different religious views and from secular views can find a way to work together on a principle like that and leave as much to individual and religious group practice as we can. It will still be imperfect, but I don't think it's impossible. I think it's very possible. I think our society does that a lot better than we're giving it credit for.
I think the key is not can these differing opinions work together to for the betterment of the larger whole, but rather that can happen and does happen when everybody at the table is willing to not impose their own set of beliefs on the other participants. So while we can honor, respect, and learn from each other, that's different than imposing a belief or a practice or something else onto others around the table. Because when there's a lot more that we share in common than we differ. And if we can highlight the commonalities, then the differences begin to fall away.
I can't resist saying I agree with that. That's why that Hillary Clinton quote, "The religious beliefs have to be changed," troubled me so much. It wasn't like, I'm not going to impose mine on you and everything. When somebody in government talks about changing religious beliefs, that's antithetical to what the rabbi just said and what I think the First Amendment requires.
Although I will say, I think she meant that radical beliefs that impose behaviors that are antithetical to society should be changed, rather than a general term.
I'd have been a lot happier if she said should change, but when it turns into have to be changed, by whom? That scared me.
Yes, great panel. My question has to do with the growing population of the Muslim community. And to the rabbi and the reverend, have you had any engagements with that community to see if there's any, we have a strong Judeo-Christian foundation, but have you had any engagements with the Muslim community to see where they stand on similar things to help us stand against, the secular part or the government imposing on our religion? So I'm just curious whether you've had any dialogue with the Muslim community.
So I'm fairly new to the city, so I haven't had a lot of opportunity to be with various different groups, although I did have some conversations early on with some of the representatives from the Muslim community about things that we might be able to do together, and I think that'll progress. I know in the past, in Ottawa, where I came from, we had a very vibrant interfaith dialogue between the Jewish community, the various different Muslim communities, the Sunnis, the Shias, some of the other groups, and so, and again, I think that there is amazing things to be shared and be learned from each other as we engage in those. So I'm looking forward to that, but it hasn't happened yet. I don't know if I'm sure it has happened in the past at Temple. Yes, somebody at Temple.
And I'll give the old-timers perspective, having lived through during the time of lots of immigration to Erie, to the point that, as I sometimes like to point out to my fellow Episcopalians outside of Erie, that there are more Muslims in Erie than there are Episcopalians in our entire diocese. And if you live in a small town 50 miles from here, you would never dream that. Very little. And part of the, with some hopeful beginnings now, but part of the problem has been that the Muslim community has not had clear identifiable leaders to relate to. That's been difficult. They come from different parts of the world, different expressions of Islam. A lot are people at the universities and such, but there isn't a clearly identified imam or imams that we can relate to as religious leaders. So I hope that it happens, because it desperately needs to happen, and it certainly is going on in lots of other cities where it's fairly normal now, and it's just something that it really needs to happen here in Erie. And I think, honestly, I'm going to say that interfaith and interreligious relationships, there are some good folks in Erie that are working on those things, but it's very small. It needs to grow. We need to grow it.
Well, thanks everyone for coming. And I want to just briefly address the Muslim issue. The reason we did not invite a representative of the Muslim faith was because our goal originally was to bring individuals from the faiths that were predominant here when the country was founded. So that was the reason we did not invite them. Okay? Let's give our